Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Kentucky Hill Country. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year is 1881. Tucked into the rugged folds of Kentucky's hill country, well beyond the main railroad lines, stood a county orphanage few outside the district ever heard of. At the time, small institutions like this were scattered across rural America, some operating in good faith, others little more than holding pens for children who had no one to claim them. In the larger national picture, the orphan train movement was reshaping how abandoned children were relocated, with thousands shipped westward to new families. But in isolated counties like this one, care fell to local boards, to church committees, or to whichever landholder could provide a structure that might pass for a home. The county orphanage in question was a two-story brick structure built originally as a poorhouse in the 1850s. It sat on a slope overlooking a narrow river bend, half hidden by sycamore and hickory trees. Local deeds describe its construction as sturdy though unadorned, with iron shutters on the cellar windows and an attached smokehouse to the rear. In 1872, after a brief fire damaged the roof, the county acquired it formally and declared it an institution for foundlings, pauper children, and the occasional abandoned infant left at the courthouse steps. Records from the fiscal court meeting of that year mention the name of Reverend Matthew Harrow, a Presbyterian minister said to have argued fiercely that the children should be set apart from the rabble of the almshouse. His proposal gained traction, though the county's budget was meager. What resulted was a place neither entirely charitable nor properly supervised. It relied on a rotating staff of matrons and hired hands, many of whom lasted only months before resigning. The earliest surviving testimonies, preserved in county archives, hint at unease. One visitor in 1874, Dr. Eli Harkness, a physician sent to inspect sanitary conditions, wrote in his report, "The structure is adequate, but its situation is gloomy. The children appear listless, and there is a silence about the place unnatural in a house where young souls reside." Local folklore remembers those silences too. Farmers living along the ridges spoke of evenings when the orphanage lamps glowed faintly, yet no voices of play or song could be heard. The building seemed withdrawn into itself, as though waiting. By the late 1870s, complaints reached the county board. Food deliveries unaccounted for, ledgers missing entire weeks of expenses, matrons dismissing children as gone to kinfolk without formal papers. Nothing was pursued vigorously. These were hills where news traveled slow, and where questions too persistent were seen as troublemaking. Still, unease grew. A neighbor, Mrs. Ann Caldwell, testified years later that she had once seen two boys standing by the orchard fence at dusk, staring blankly as though uncertain how they'd come to be there. The next week, when she brought bread to the home, the matron insisted only one of those boys had ever been in residence. By 1880, a new superintendent was appointed, Jonathan Clymer, a former clerk in the county courthouse. Clymer was known for his precise handwriting and his eagerness to bring order to neglected matters. His arrival marked a shift, at least on paper. Ledgers suddenly filled with neat columns of provisions, shoes, and medicines supposedly issued to the children. But later, comparison of receipts suggested something different. Quantities ordered never matched the few items actually found within the walls, a discrepancy that hinted at supplies being diverted, or worse, never purchased at all. Clymer defended his books by pointing out the county's chronic underfunding. He insisted any shortages were due to delayed shipments, yet the orphans themselves seemed thinner each season. Testimonies collected decades later preserve the voices of local farmhands who worked briefly as attendants. One, a man named Samuel Hodge, recalled in 1912 that children went to bed hungry more often than not, and sometimes they were locked in the cellar as punishment for asking. His account was published in a regional newspaper long after the orphanage had closed. but it was consistent with whispered rumors in the valley. This was also the period when national inspectors, influenced by the broader debate surrounding the orphan train system, began advocating for better record-keeping in county institutions. A brief note survives from an 1880 circular sent by the Kentucky State Board of Charities. Registers must be kept in clear order. The public will demand accountability of our county homes. Whether the county orphanage received or ignored this instruction is unclear. No such registers were preserved intact, only fragments. By autumn of 1881, neighbors grew concerned again. They spoke of children no longer seen gathering berries near the fence line or splashing at the river's edge, where, since there had been perhaps 20 voices, fewer than a dozen seemed to remain. When asked, Clymer assured visiting officials that the rest have gone to extended kin. No names were ever listed. No carriage arrivals were noted at the courthouse. It was as though children had simply dissolved into the hills. One entry in the county constable's log records a visit in late October. Constable Reuben Talbot wrote tersely, "The home is tidy at surface glance, yet the halls smell of mildew and something else, faint but persistent, not unlike spoiled meat." He was not called back for another inspection. His note remained buried in the back pages of the ledger until rediscovered by archivists in the 1930s. For the local families, the orphanage had already begun to recede into a kind of fearful silence. Children were warned not to wander near its grounds. On Sunday walks, passing worshippers from Harrow's own congregation were said to avert their eyes when climbing the ridge road. What once had been a point of modest civic pride was by now regarded with unease, if not shame. It was in this atmosphere, scarcity, silence, and unanswered questions, that the first undeniable discovery came to light, a discovery that pulled the county orphanage from rumor into record. The discovery began not with officials, but with a boy from a nearby farm. In December 1881, 12-year-old Joseph Raines was hunting rabbits along the edge of the orphanage property. Following a trail into the undergrowth, he stumbled upon a shallow depression where the soil had recently been disturbed. Raines later told his father that a scrap of cloth protruded from the earth, soiled but recognizable as part of a child's garment. His father, uneasy but cautious, reported it to the sheriff. What followed was a brief, reluctant inquiry. Sheriff Jameson and 2 deputies rode out, questioned Superintendent Clymer, and were told that old refuse pits had been covered over for sanitary reasons. He led them to a rear corner of the grounds where ashes, bones, and discarded rags had been buried over the years. The sheriff accepted this explanation, though his deputies later confided doubts. One recalled that the fragment shown to them by Raines did not look like refuse, but rather a sleeve, hemmed, small enough for a girl of 8 or 9. The official record closed with a line, "Matter considered resolved, no further action necessary." Word of the incident, however, seeped into local conversation. Families whispered that children were vanishing, not into kinship placements, but into the earth itself. The Caldwell family, long the closest neighbors, recalled hearing strange hammering in the nights around that time, as if timbers were being nailed within the cellar. Others described seeing lantern light flickering behind shuttered windows well past midnight. What deepened suspicion was the case of Mary Ellen Doherty, a girl of 11 placed in the orphanage in early 1880. Her uncle came later that year to reclaim her, bringing with him signed papers. Clymer at first claimed no such girl was ever registered. When pressed, he admitted she had been transferred westward to a family under the auspices of a charitable society. Yet no society could be found that listed her name, nor did the county courthouse have any record of the transfer. The uncle petitioned for further inquiry, but the court dismissed it as hearsay. By the following year, Mary Ellen was simply another name absent from any surviving ledger. Meanwhile, conditions inside worsened. Accounts from 2 former matrons, recorded years later, paint a picture of growing neglect. One described children huddled together for warmth in a room with broken panes, too frightened to ask for more coal. Another recalled that meals were so sparse, a crust of bread was a feast. When pressed on discipline, both remembered that Clymer frequently used the cellar for confinement. No one spoke of what exactly occurred there, only that children returned paler, quieter, sometimes unable to look you in the eye. The orphanage thus became a paradox in local memory. Outwardly a county institution, inwardly a place shrouded in secrecy. And as winter drew deeper into 1881, more questions surfaced. Families noticed two figures seen often on the ridge path at night, men who stood watching the building from afar. Their identities remain uncertain. Some claimed they were drifters. Others whispered they were connected to the orphanage itself, guards or messengers in the shadows. They never approached homes, never spoke, only lingered until darkness swallowed them. By January of 1882, the county board could no longer ignore the murmurs. A request for inspection was filed, though it was worded cautiously, perhaps to avoid offending Superintendent Clymer. The task fell to Dr. Amos Pritchard, a physician with modest standing in the region. His notes, later rediscovered in a bundle of unindexed files, reveal an unsettling visit. He wrote, "The house presents a face of order, yet within I find an air heavy and close. The wards are quiet to the point of unnaturalness. The children answer only when pressed, their eyes drifting as though rehearsed." Pritchard noted the lack of laughter, of play, of even idle chatter. He remarked that although the ledgers listed a population of 17, he could account for only 9 children present. When asked directly about the missing names, Clymer assured him that placements had been arranged, though no paperwork was provided. Pritchard's report, though troubling, ended with a line that undermined its own findings. "Nothing immediately hazardous to health noted." Perhaps wary of political consequences, the physician allowed his unease to be softened into ambiguity. The county board accepted it and took no action. But stories continued to spread. Neighbors spoke of an odor drifting from the grounds on damp mornings, something sharper than wood smoke, lingering low across the hollows. Hunters claimed to have found animal bones scattered near the stream, though some said they looked too small, too fine-jointed to be swine or deer. Such accounts could never be verified, but they circulated widely, feeding suspicion. It was also during this winter that Reverend Harrow, the man who had once championed the separation of children from the almshouse, attempted a pastoral visit. His notes, found in the margin of an 1882 sermon draft, mention a disquieting refusal. "I was denied entry to the cellar on Grovehouse. Nenes of disrepair. Yet from behind the locked door I fancied I heard the sound of movement, not scurrying vermin, but measured pacing, as though of a child compelled to march." He did not press the matter further. Within months, his family relocated to another county. What remains most striking in these testimonies is how consistent the silences were. The orphanage existed. It housed children, and yet the surrounding community rarely heard those children's voices. Even the Caldwell farm, whose porch sat within earshot of the grounds, described nights so still that the building might have been abandoned. Only on rare occasions did they glimpse candlelight in upper windows or see a small figure standing behind the warped glass. Into this void of sound and proof stepped rumor, and rumor hardened into conviction. A group of local men, led by the Caldwell brothers, planned a discreet entry to the orphanage one February night. They intended, by their own words later, to settle for ourselves whether children truly lived within those walls. Armed with lanterns, they approached after midnight, but were intercepted by a pair of watchful eyes, 2 men standing motionless along the ridge. The intruders retreated before they reached the door. The watchers never advanced, never threatened, yet their presence alone was enough. The next morning, the Caldwell brothers told neighbors they had been turned back by figures who seemed to wait for them. That failed attempt did not end curiosity. Instead, it drew attention to the notion that the orphanage was guarded, not by law or county, but by shadows whose loyalty was unclear. The spring of 1882 brought heavier rains than usual, and with the rains came erosion along the ridge road leading past the orphanage. It was here that another discovery disturbed the uneasy quiet. A wagon driver named Elias Brewer reported that part of the bank had collapsed near the smokehouse, exposing what appeared to be timbers set into the hillside. At first glance, they looked like remnants of an old storage shed, buried by runoff. But Brewer insisted the timbers framed a door, sealed and partly rotted, with iron hinges rusting into the clay. He told his account in town, and for a week, discussion swirled around whether the orphanage contained hidden structures. Clymer dismissed the story outright, calling it a ditch washed out by the storm. Yet those who walked the ridge themselves claimed otherwise, a set of beams distinctly squared and once fitted together by hand. The county board did not commission a search. Officials cited lack of funds and the impropriety of trespassing on county property without a formal vote. But in the community, the rumor hardened into legend. Beneath the orphanage lay rooms unseen, sealed for purposes unknown. Mrs. Caldwell, already watchful, later told her grown children that the rain seemed to wake something under the ground, as though the hill itself was shifting in discomfort. Meanwhile, reports of children dwindled further. Schoolmaster records from the district show that, while in 1876 the orphanage sent 5 pupils to the county schoolhouse, by 1882, only 1 remained enrolled. No clear explanation was ever entered into the logbooks. The lone pupil, a boy named Thomas, was described as quiet, pale, and quick to flinch at sudden sounds. When pressed about his companions at the orphanage, he told the schoolmaster only that some are below. Asked to clarify, he fell silent and did not speak again. The remark was recorded in the school ledger, a curiosity rather than evidence, and then forgotten for years. Throughout that spring, 2 figures continued to appear on the ridge path at night. More than one neighbor confirmed seeing them. Men of medium build, always still, always watching the orphanage from a distance. They never approached farms, never entered town. Some swore they carried lanterns whose light they never raised. Others claimed their outlines looked blurred, as if the mist itself clung too tightly around them. Theories varied. Some believed they were county guards hired secretly by Clymer to discourage trespass. Others suggested they were kin of the missing children, watching in mourning or anger. Yet the strangest version came from an old farmer named Elkanah Bird, who claimed the men bore a resemblance to 2 paupers buried decades earlier when the site was still a poorhouse. His words were dismissed as fancy, but they were remembered. By midsummer, the county orphanage stood in growing isolation. Supplies still arrived, but fewer wagons stopped there. Children were almost never seen. The voices of play, once absent, had now given way to an even deeper quiet, the hush of a building that seemed to hold its breath. What lay behind its cellar doors, or beneath the earth newly exposed by rains, was left unanswered, but whispers insisted that if anyone dared to look, the ground itself would tell the truth. The ledgers never did. The summer of 1882 marked a turning point. In July, a group of townspeople petitioned for a more formal investigation into the county orphanage. Their appeal was modest, worded with deference, but it carried 30 signatures, enough to force the board's attention. Minutes from the meeting survive in fragments, recording cautious debate. Several officials argued that the orphanage's matters should not be pried into without warrant of cause. Yet others admitted unease. Ultimately, they appointed a committee of 2 men, Clerk Silas Morton and Deputy Constable Abel Greer. Their task was to review ledgers, count children, and report back. On July 17th, Morton and Greer entered the orphanage in daylight. Their surviving notes, though brief, are haunting. Greer wrote, "The children we saw numbered 7. They did not speak freely. All appeared thin. We asked after others listed in the record. Superintendent Clymer said they had been relocated to kinfolk or fostered out west. No documents presented." Morton added only, "The cellar is locked, keys not offered, windows shuttered and nailed." Their report was filed, and though it raised questions, no action followed. The committee concluded there was no immediate evidence of cruelty, and the board let the matter rest. Yet accounts suggest Morton was unsettled. Weeks later, he told a colleague at the courthouse that he had felt a draft rising from under the floorboards, carrying with it a smell not proper to any clean house. His remark was never entered in formal record, but circulated privately, feeding the sense that something lay hidden. As the year advanced, the orphanage grew stranger still. Families passing along the ridge reported seeing only 2 or 3 children at a time, and sometimes none at all. Yet faint singing was heard drifting from the building at hours when no light showed. One farm girl described it as a lullaby sung in tones too deep for a child. Her father told her not to repeat the tale, but she did, years later, in a deposition taken by a regional historian. The figures on the ridge persisted as well. In late August, a peddler from Lexington claimed to see them at dawn, standing by the orchard fence. He greeted them but received no reply. He noted they were dressed in plain coats, yet their faces seemed indistinct, as though hidden by shadow despite the morning light. When he looked back a moment later, they were gone. In September, an incident forced the matter back into county hands. A traveling midwife named Prudence Kell came to the orphanage seeking to tend to one of the matrons, rumored to be ill. She was admitted, and what she saw left her shaken. In her sworn affidavit, preserved in the courthouse vault, she stated, "Several rooms were bare, containing no bedding fit for children. In the cellar stairwell, I observed stains upon the stone. When I inquired, the matron shut the door swiftly and said it was from spilled medicine." Kell insisted the stains resembled blood. Her report, though alarming, was never acted upon with urgency. By then officials had grown weary of accusations they felt could not be substantiated. The orphanage thus lingered in a state of twilight, officially tolerated, privately feared, and all the while the number of children said to reside within its walls continued to shrink. By winter, whispers claimed fewer than 5 remained. Winter of 1882 was bitter in the hills, and with it came another disappearance. A boy named Daniel, one of the few still attending lessons at the county schoolhouse, stopped appearing altogether. His teacher recorded in the ledger, "Absent without explanation. Superintendent claims relocation." Yet no papers supported the claim, and Daniel's name never appeared in any later census. His absence deepened suspicion among the community. Even those who had once dismissed rumors began to wonder if the orphanage was concealing more than neglect. One of the few individuals to speak openly was Constable Talbot, the same man who had noted the odor the year prior. In a letter to a colleague in neighboring Madison County, he described the orphanage as a house that swallows its own. The letter survived only because it was later found among private family papers. At the time, Talbot's words carried no weight with the county board, which preferred to maintain silence rather than spark scandal. Folklore from this period began to mix with fact. Stories spread that on moonless nights, faint scratching could be heard beneath the orphanage grounds, as though from buried timbers or hollow spaces underground. Children in nearby farms claimed they heard knocking from the hillside when they passed along the road. Their parents hushed them, unwilling to inflame fear, but such tales entered oral tradition and were passed down for generations. Midway through that winter, Reverend Harrow, though long relocated, sent a letter to a former parishioner. In it, he confessed regret at having supported the orphanage's establishment. He wrote, "I fear we have built a house not of refuge, but of forgetting, where the young are kept not for nurture, but for silence." His words were remembered decades later when historians tried to piece together the case. At the same time, the 2 figures on the ridge became sus and more brazen. Several families swore they saw them approach closer to the building itself, standing by the shuttered cellar windows. One neighbor, watching from a distance, believed he saw them pass something through the bars, a bundle small enough to fit in a hand. What it contained was never known. The same neighbor later said that when he called out, both figures turned their heads in perfect unison, then vanished into the trees. By early 1883, fear among the townsfolk had grown too heavy to ignore. A delegation pressed the county board once more, demanding a thorough search of the orphanage. This time, the board yielded, perhaps sensing that public patience had thinned. They resolved to send a team of 3, Deputy Greer, Dr. Pritchard, and a newly appointed Justice of the Peace, Thomas Radcliffe. Their charge was simple: to account for every child, inspect every room, and verify the orphanage's records. What they found on that cold March morning would confirm the worst suspicions and set the stage for the orphanage's downfall. On March 4, 1883, The inspection party arrived at the orphanage just after sunrise. Superintendent Clymer met them at the door, his manner described as brisk but guarded. The children present were assembled in the dining hall, only 6 in number. Each sat in silence, their gazes lowered, as though rehearsed. Dr. Pritchard noted their pallor and frailty, yet once again hesitated to declare mistreatment outright. Deputy Greer, however, pressed for answers. The ledgers claimed 15 children remained under county care. Clymer insisted the others had been transferred to families in adjoining states. When asked for documents, he produced a packet of letters, each unsigned, each conveniently lacking dates. Radcliffe, the justice of the peace, regarded them with suspicion. The inspectors then requested access to the entire building. The upper floors revealed little: narrow dormitories, a schoolroom nearly empty, and storerooms with scant provisions. Yet when they came to the cellar door, they found it locked. Greer demanded it opened. Clymer protested, saying the stairwell was unsafe, the stones loosened by damp. Greer replied firmly that without inspection of the cellar, the report would remain incomplete. After a tense silence, Clymer retrieved a key from his office and handed it over. The men descended into a chill space, dimly lit by their lanterns. The cellar stretched longer than expected, its walls lined with brick and stone. The odor noted in prior reports was unmistakable, something fetid, clinging to the damp air. At first they saw only old barrels and broken furniture. But at the far end, Greer discovered a door of newer timber, its planks nailed crudely, as if sealing something within. He pried one board loose. Behind it, a small chamber was revealed, scarcely 6 feet wide. The floor was dirt, disturbed and uneven. In the lantern light, what looked like scraps of cloth and small bones lay half buried. The inspectors recoiled. Pritchard insisted they withdraw at once to file an official notice. Greer, by contrast, wanted to dig further, but Radcliffe restrained him. They marked the site, resealed the chamber, and departed with strained composure. Their official report, filed days later, described the chamber only as an unauthorized addition of unsanitary condition, requiring immediate closure. No mention of bones was made. The language was vague enough to avoid scandal, yet damning enough to justify censure. The county board, faced with this report, debated action for weeks. Some favored closing the orphanage entirely. Others argued for replacing Clymer, but keeping the institution open. In the end, compromise prevailed. Clymer was quietly dismissed, and a matron named Eliza Frost was appointed in his stead. She inherited a house already poisoned by rumor, and a handful of children who seemed more like shadows than wards. Yet the most disturbing part of this episode was what remained unsaid. Greer, in private, told confidants that he had seen more than cloth and bones, that he had glimpsed the outline of a small skull in the soil. His words were never committed to the record, but they endured in family recollections passed down quietly for generations. Whether or not others believed him, the suspicion persisted, that beneath the orphanage, the earth held testimony to a truth the county dared not admit. Eliza Frost assumed control of the orphanage in April 1883. A widow of 40, she had once worked as a matron in a larger Louisville institution and carried a reputation for discipline tempered by charity. Her appointment was announced in the local paper as a renewal of hope for the county's unfortunate wards. Yet Frost quickly learned she had inherited a building steeped in silence. The children under her care, now only 5, rarely spoke above a whisper. When she tried to question them about their lives under Clymer, they lowered their eyes and shook their heads. One boy muttered a single word, "cellar," before refusing to speak further. Frost kept meticulous records, and these ledgers survive in fragments today. They show her ordering food, bedding, and coal in consistent quantities, though delivery notes suggest not all arrived. Carters occasionally reported that their wagons were intercepted before reaching the orphanage, the supplies redirected by men claiming to act on county orders. Frost protested, but officials offered no explanation. It seemed the institution was still being drained, though by whose hand remained unclear. During her first summer, Frost attempted to bring the children into town for Sunday service. The effort failed. Witnesses remembered that as the group reached the churchyard, one girl collapsed, trembling, unable to cross the threshold. Frost carried her back, visibly shaken. She did not attempt the trip again. Instead, she arranged for a circuit minister to visit the orphanage once a month. After 2 such visits, the minister declined to return, citing an atmosphere unwholesome to the spirit. His precise meaning was never clarified. Meanwhile, the watchers on the ridge remained. Frost herself recorded their presence in a letter to her sister. At dusk, I perceived 2 men at distance, always standing still, facing the house. When I approached the windows to look, they sometimes lift their hands as if in greeting, yet never step forward. I cannot account for them. The letter is preserved in a private collection, a chilling testament to her unease. In September of 1883, another incident deepened the orphanage's mystery. Heavy rains again undermined the slope behind the smokehouse, widening the washout first noticed the year before. This time, the collapse revealed not timbers, but a stone arch, part of a tunnel leading back beneath the orphanage. Frost summoned county officials, but only a single clerk arrived to examine it. His note in the courthouse file reads simply, "Arch of unknown origin, unsafe, sealed at once." Within days, the entrance was bricked over, yet neighbors who passed the site before it was sealed claimed they saw within the tunnel wooden crates stacked against the wall. Their contents were never known. Frost persevered through these troubles, but by the year's end, she had written in her ledger, "I cannot account for what has passed here before me. The walls breathe with secrets. The children live, but as though half buried themselves." By then, only 4 remained. Where the 5th had gone, no one could say. The winter of 1883 to 84 left the county orphanage nearly cut off. Snow blocked the ridge road, and supplies dwindled to what Frost could coax from neighboring farms. The children grew gaunt, though she did what she could with bread and broth. Her ledger notes one cryptic entry on January 19th. "Another gone, no record offered. The others do not ask, only stare." The identity of the missing child was never made clear, nor does any county document acknowledge the loss. That February, Frost appealed directly to the county board for additional funds and oversight. She received no reply. Instead, an unsigned notice was delivered by hand, instructing her to keep operations quiet until spring, when officials could decide the matter. The phrasing unsettled her, for it implied that the orphanage was to be managed less as a home than as a problem to be contained. Meanwhile, the watchers did not relent. Farmers trudging through the snow swore they saw 2 figures standing against the white hills, their outlines stark in the moonlight. One teamster told of halting his wagon when he saw them on the ridge, both raising their arms in unison, as if pointing toward the orphanage itself. He left his load of firewood at the roadside and did not return until daylight. When spring finally arrived, Frost's patience broke. She traveled to the county seat, carrying with her a bundle of documents, her ledgers, letters of complaint, and notes about the missing children. She demanded a hearing before the fiscal court. Yet her testimony was dismissed as the words of a woman too burdened with sorrowful duty. The board resolved only to appoint another inspection later that summer. No immediate action was taken. What happened next is pieced together from scattered accounts. In May 1884, smoke was seen rising from the orphanage grounds. Neighbors rushed to the ridge, fearing fire. Instead, they fought under a smoldering pit near the bricked-over tunnel. Frost stood by it, pale and shaken, claiming she had discovered rotted crates in a storage shed and chosen to burn them. When asked what the crates contained, she refused to answer. One farmer later swore he saw scraps of children's shoes among the ashes. The claim could not be proven, but it spread quickly. By midsummer, the orphanage stood nearly empty. Only 2 children remained with Frost, their faces expressionless, their silence deeper than ever. She wrote in her final surviving note, "I believe the house has consumed more than I can reckon. Whether by hand of man or shadow of past, it leaves only absence. I will not remain through another winter." Within weeks, she departed, leaving the 2 children in the custody of a local farmer. The county declared the orphanage temporarily closed and boarded its windows. No new superintendent was appointed, and just like that, The institution that had swallowed so many lives slipped quietly into abandonment. The closure of the county orphanage did not bring resolution. Instead, it birthed a void into which rumor, folklore, and fear rushed. By the autumn of 1884, the building stood shuttered, its brick walls streaked with soot and moss. Officially, it remained county property, but no one volunteered to maintain it. The roof began to sag, and shutters rattled loose in the wind. Travelers passing along the ridge claimed to hear faint cries carried on the night air, though no one was supposed to be inside. The county made one last attempt to reckon with the property in 1885. Records show a motion to sell the land, but the proposal failed when no buyer could be found. Farmers balked at owning a structure so tainted by suspicion. One man, a timber merchant named Hollis Webb, briefly considered repurposing the building as a boarding house for workers. He abandoned the idea after visiting the grounds, later telling neighbors, "The walls lean toward you like listeners, and the cellar breathes as though it has lungs." His words entered local legend, repeated in hushed tones for decades. Meanwhile, stories about the missing children began to circulate beyond the county. A regional newspaper in Lexington published a brief column noting that discrepancies in orphan registers had drawn concern. The article made no mention of bones or tunnels, but it stirred just enough curiosity that distant readers sent letters asking for clarification. None were ever answered. County officials feared scandal and chose silence. It was during this period that the watchers on the ridge appeared one final time. At least 3 separate witnesses described seeing them in the summer of 1885, 2 figures standing together at dusk, looking toward the orphanage. One farmer claimed they walked slowly down the slope and paused at the bricked-over tunnel before fading into the trees. After that year, no further sightings were recorded. Whether they were men of flesh or shadows of memory, no one could say. By 1886, the building had fallen into disuse entirely. Windows were smashed by weather, doors swung from rusting hinges. Yet locals avoided scavenging its timbers, saying the wood would not burn clean, or carried the cries of children in its grain. Even those desperate for firewood chose to let it rot rather than bring pieces of it into their homes. Into the late 1880s, wandering preachers and traveling peddlers occasionally stayed on the grounds, bedding down in the upper rooms. A few left accounts in diaries, strange drafts that extinguished lamps, the sensation of being watched from corners, and once the sound of small feet pacing overhead when no other lodger was present. These were anecdotes, never formally reported, but they layered onto the orphanage's growing reputation as a cursed place. Thus the county orphanage, once intended as refuge, had become a ruin, a hollow shell in the Kentucky hills, avoided by those who lived closest, yet whispered about by those who passed through. And though the county tried repeatedly to erase it from memory, the land itself seemed unwilling to forget. By the early 1890s, the county orphanage had already entered folklore. Children in the valley were told not to wander too close, lest they be taken by the house that eats the lost. Farmers, when questioned by travelers, referred to the ridge as a place best passed by before sundown. In courthouse records, the property is scarcely mentioned, except for occasional motions to condemn it as unsafe. None carried through, perhaps because officials feared uncovering what might still lie beneath. It was in 1892 that the building briefly drew scholarly attention. A professor of sociology from Louisville, Edwin McCready, toured the hill country, studying conditions of poverty and child welfare. His diary, now archived at the State University, includes an entry about the abandoned orphanage. He described approaching it one afternoon and finding the structure stark, like a husk of memory. He noted the cellar doors nailed shut and the rear hillside still showing signs of collapse. Most unsettling, he claimed, was the silence. Not even birdsong near the eaves, as though nature itself has withdrawn from this place. McCready later mentioned the orphanage in a lecture, comparing its failures to those documented in the broader orphan train movement. His remarks drew little attention at the time, but they preserved a rare outsider's confirmation of local lore. Meanwhile, neighbors continued to share strange experiences. A midwife traveling past the ridge claimed she heard children singing, though the windows were dark. A group of hunters, camping near the stream in 1894, swore they saw lamplight flickering behind the bricked-over tunnel entrance. One approached and felt the stones radiating warmth, though no fire was visible. The hunters left before dawn, unwilling to linger. County officials remained determined to let the building decay. In 1896, they finally stripped its furnishing, auctioning what little could be sold. The proceeds were meager. One buyer, a carpenter, later returned the bed springs he had purchased, saying they groaned as though a weight lay upon them even when bare. After that, no further sales were attempted. By the turn of the century, the orphanage was a ruin, roof sagging, weeds choking the courtyard, windows gaping like sockets. Yet even in ruin, it cast a shadow. Locals insisted that children passing along the ridge would grow quiet, staring at the building until led away. Travelers recorded dreams of being followed by small footsteps after resting nearby. And though the county no longer spoke its name aloud, the silence surrounding the orphanage only deepened its place in the hidden history of the Kentucky hills. The 20th century brought new generations, but the memory of the orphanage lingered like smoke in the hills. By 1905, only fragments of walls and the shell of the roof remained, yet even in its collapse the site drew uneasy notice. School children dared each other to creep onto the grounds, reporting afterwards that the air grew colder the closer they came. Some swore they heard doors creaking, though none remained standing. Their parents chastised them, warning that the land was cursed by the weight of forgotten names. In 1910, a surveyor named Franklin Lattimore, hired to chart county boundaries, documented the orphanage ruins. His notes are factual, almost clinical. Foundation stones, cellar partially caved, remnants of iron hinges, and scorched timbers buried in the soil. Yet tucked into the margin of his field book is a single, unsettling line. Voices of children, though no one present. Scholars later debated whether this was shorthand for local folklore or a personal observation. Either way, it reinforced the aura of dread that clung to the property. During this period, descendants of families once connected to the orphanage began to speak more openly. The Caldwell grandchildren told interviewers that their elders had kept bread on the porch at night for the ones wandering from the ridge. They never saw who took it, only that the loaves were gone by morning. Meanwhile, others recalled stories of the two figures who had stood watch on the ridge in the 1880s. By now, the tale had shifted into near myth. The watchers described not as men, but as keepers, bound to the orphanage even after its closure. Whether protectors or captors, no one could agree. In 1915, a fire swept through nearby woods, threatening to consume the ridge. When it reached the orphanage grounds, however, witnesses swore the flames bent around the ruin, sparing it while blackening everything even. A newspaper article described it as a curious draft of wind that deflected the blaze, though locals insisted it was the land itself refusing to release what lay beneath. By the 1920s, the orphanage had all but vanished from official memory. County records no longer listed it. Maps showed only blank hillside. Yet folklore ensured it was never entirely forgotten. Young couples out walking at dusk claimed to see lanterns moving in the distance. Travelers reported dreams of children following them after camping nearby. And though no foundation stones were visible from the road, residents swore that on misty mornings the outline of the building could still be seen, rising faintly as though sketched against the fog. The county may have tried to erase the orphanage, but its shadow remained, embedded not just in documents and whispers, but in the very soil of the Kentucky hills. By the 1930s, folklorists and local historians began piecing together what they called the forgotten institutions of the hills. Among their notes, the county orphanage resurfaced as a case both elusive and troubling. Professor Clara Henshaw of Berea College conducted interviews with elderly residents who still remembered the building in its final years. Her field notes described the consistent themes: missing children, sealed rooms, and two silent figures who lingered on the ridge. She published a brief paper in 1934, suggesting the orphanage might serve as an example of systemic neglect endemic to rural institutions of the late 19th century. Yet in her private letters, preserved at the college archives, her tone is darker. I have gathered too many testimonies to dismiss the whispers. Something was buried there, not only children, but memory itself, as if the county conspired with silence. Meanwhile, Depression-era workers employed by the WPA occasionally stumbled upon the site while mapping roads and trails. One crew, in 1937, reported uncovering fragments of brick foundation and rusted ironwork. They used the stones briefly for a roadside culvert, but abandoned the effort when one man claimed the stones sang like voices when struck with a hammer. The incident was dismissed as a jest, yet the men refused to return for more material. Oral histories collected in this period also preserve the persistence of unease. A farmer named Delbert Rowe told interviewers that his father, decades earlier, had seen small handprints pressed into frost along the orphanage fence long after the building was closed. Another family recalled leaving water basins on their porch for travelers, only to find them disturbed at dawn, with no tracks leading to or from the vessel. Such accounts blurred the line between memory and superstition, yet they were repeated often enough to shape the orphanage's legend for generations. The wider public, however, paid little attention. The orphanage never entered state histories or educational texts. It survived instead in footnotes and whispered tales, a shadow barely acknowledged. Still, its story echoed faintly whenever discussions turned to the failures of child welfare in the era of the orphan train and the countless county homes that dotted America's rural map. The Kentucky site, though unnamed, was often held up by locals as the darkest example, an institution swallowed not only by neglect, but by something deeper, harder to name. By the end of the 1930s, the ridge itself had grown over with forest. Only a few low stones marked where the orphanage once stood. Yet visitors continued to speak of unease. One WPA worker, returning years later, wrote in his journal, "The trees are tall now, but standing there, one feels the weight of a roof long gone, as though the house remains invisible, waiting." Through the 1940s, the county orphanage became a story told mostly around kitchen tables and front porches, a tale to hush restless children or warn them against wandering too far into the woods. Yet even stripped of walls and timbers, the site retained its pull. Hunters spoke of dogs refusing to enter the grove where the foundations lay. One veteran, returned from Europe in 1946, claimed the silence of the ridge reminded him of abandoned villages he had seen during the war, places evacuated in haste, yet somehow still inhabited by memory. During this decade, archivists working on county histories attempted to gather official records of the orphanage. What they found was striking: ledgers missing entire years, inspection reports half burned, letters unsigned or abruptly cut off. A clerk noted bitterly in a margin, "The county has forgotten with great convenience." To this day, the scattered fragments form a puzzle with more gaps than answers, leaving researchers to rely heavily on oral accounts. One particularly unsettling recollection came from an aging schoolteacher who testified that in the winter of 1882 she had asked her pupil Thomas about his companions at the orphanage. He had whispered that "some are below." Decades later, retelling the exchange, she still shivered. It was not what he said, but the way he looked at the floor, as if he could hear them beneath us. During the late 1940s, regional writers began to fold the orphanage into broader collections of Kentucky ghost stories. Yet in these retellings, fact and legend blurred. Some tales placed phantom children along the road. Others spoke of lights moving in the cellar long after its collapse. A few embellished the watchers on the ridge, describing them not as men, but as figures in black coats, with faces too pale to belong to the living. Though sensationalized, these stories kept the memory of the orphanage alive, even as county officials tried to distance themselves from it. By 1950, the site had become an unmarked ruin, swallowed by trees. But still, travelers wrote of odd sensations when passing near it. A hiker described hearing the sound of children chanting numbers, though he was alone. Another claimed he found the earth disturbed, as if something had been buried or unearthed recently, though no tools or tracks could be seen. Each account, unverifiable, fed the legend. And so the orphanage lingered, not as a building, but as an absence, a silence heavy enough to bend memory and rumor alike. Even as America entered a new century of reform and progress, the hollow in the Kentucky hills remained, a reminder that some houses never truly vanish, even when their stones are scattered and their names erased. By the 1960s, the orphanage site had become a place of furtive pilgrimage for teenagers and local dare-seekers. The ridge road was still passable, and on summer nights young people drove up to test their courage. Accounts collected later described the same pattern: laughter at first, then sudden quiet as they approached the grove. Some claimed the air grew noticeably colder, even in July. Others spoke of a pressure in the ears, like descending into deep water. A few swore they heard footsteps circling them, though no one was visible. Such stories were passed down in whispers, often dismissed as youthful imagination, yet they echoed the unease noted in records nearly a century earlier. Folklorists visiting in 1967 noted how consistently the same motifs reappeared: the watchers on the ridge, the sound of children underground, the cellar that still seemed to breathe. Interviews with local elders revealed that even those who scoffed at superstition refused to linger near the site after dark. One farmer put it bluntly, "It ain't ghosts I fear, it's the memory of what men let happen there." During this same period, national discussions of institutional abuse began surfacing in journals and reports. Advocates for child welfare pointed out how county homes of the 19th century often operated without oversight, their records incomplete or deliberately obscured. In this broader light, the Kentucky orphanage appeared less an isolated rumor and more a part of a troubling pattern. Scholars cited the orphan train era as a reminder of how children were treated as commodities, shuffled across states with little record. Though the orphanage itself remained unnamed in academic works, its story lived on in the county as the darkest local example. By the early 1970s, only a scattering of foundation stones and the faint depression of the cellar remained. Trees pressed close around it, their roots cracking through what was left of the brickwork. Yet hikers reported that the ground still felt hollow in places, as if chambers remained beneath. Some insisted they heard faint knocking when standing over the depression, like wood striking stone deep below. Such claims could never be proven, but they persisted, adding new layers to the orphanage's legend. Even as modern roads and towns expanded, the ridge remained oddly untouched. Developers surveyed it twice, once in 1974 and again in 1979, but neither project advanced. One engineer later remarked that soil tests gave back readings that didn't make sense, voids where no voids should be. He could not explain it, and the plans were quietly abandoned. The orphanage, long since erased from maps, continued to resist erasure from the land itself. By the 1980s, the story of the county orphanage had become more legend than history, but every decade seemed to bring new claims that tethered it back to reality. Campers who pitched tents along the nearby river told of hearing the faint chiming of a bell, though no church stood within miles. One man swore he saw a line of children walking single file through the trees at dusk, their figures dissolving into mist when approached. Skeptics dismissed these as tales born from bourbon and campfire nerves, yet they mirrored details found in century-old testimonies. Archivists in Louisville renewed interest in the site in 1983 when they unearthed Dr. Pritchard's original inspection notes. Though cautious in their wording, the rediscovered papers referenced the unsanitary chamber beneath the orphanage, evidence long suspected but rarely documented. Local newspapers briefly covered the finding, and for a short while the story returned to public memory. Older residents shook their heads knowingly, younger readers dismissed it as exaggeration, and officials remained silent. Nothing more came of it. Still, the ridge attracted quiet visitors. Amateur historians carried tape recorders, hoping to capture unexplained sounds. Paranormal enthusiasts snapped photographs, claiming to capture pale faces at cellar level where only shadows should have been. None of the evidence proved conclusive, but each attempt reinforced the sense that the ground itself resisted closure. One haunting recollection from this decade came from a retired sheriff's deputy who spoke anonymously to a folklorist. He claimed his grandfather, Deputy Greer of the 1883 inspection, had confessed late in life that he saw a small skull in the earth, clean as porcelain. The family, ashamed, never spoke of it openly, but the deputy insisted the confession weighed heavily until the old man's death. Such testimony, unvarious, fiable but deeply personal, lent an unsettling gravity to the story. By the close of the 1980s, the site was nearly invisible beneath brush and second-growth forest. Yet hikers still reported a strange geometry to the ground, a hollow where sound echoed oddly, as though the soil rang like stone when struck. Some claimed compasses spun in circles there. Others said they felt a pull in their chest, a weight they could not explain. Folklorists noted that the language of these reports echoed earlier accounts almost exactly, suggesting a continuity of experience that defied coincidence. The county, as always, maintained silence. No plaques marked the orphanage, no histories named it. Officially, it had vanished. Yet in the hills themselves, and in the whispered recollections of those who dared to visit, its presence endured, quiet, unsettling, and unresolved. Into the 1990s and beyond, the orphanage passed fully into legend, yet its shadow never lifted from the Kentucky hill country. Locals still referred to the ridge in lowered voices, calling it the Hollow House Ground. Hikers who strayed too close spoke of a sudden hush in the forest, as if even cicadas fell silent. Some claimed to feel watched from the tree line, and a few admitted to glimpsing two distant figures, motionless side by side, just as their grandparents and great-grandparents had described more than a century earlier. In 1997, a small team of graduate students from a regional university conducted a survey of forgotten county institutions. They documented the site with photographs and soil cores. Their official report concluded little beyond confirming subsurface voids near the cellar depression. But in private notes, later shared among colleagues, one student wrote, "When the drill bit reached deeper clay, the sound changed, hollow, almost like striking a box. We stopped. None of us wanted to keep going." The data was filed away, never published. The folklore persisted into the 21st century. Local storytellers wove the orphanage into collections of Appalachian hauntings, while amateur investigators shared recordings online of what they claimed were children's voices calling faintly through static. Scholars remained cautious, framing the tale as a warning about neglect in isolated institutions, its truth blurred by time. Yet within the county, older residents still swore that something darker had occurred, something never fully acknowledged. And so the story lingers, of a county orphanage opened in hope and closed in silence, its records lost, its children unaccounted for, of cellar doors sealed, tunnels bricked, and chambers that seemed to breathe long after the last matron departed, of watchers who stood guard on the ridge, waiting in stillness for Rizzo, as never explained. Today, hikers report unease when passing the grove. Some hear faint singing carried on the wind, others feel the ground give slightly underfoot, as though hollow. Whether memory, superstition, or something more, the echoes remain. The county orphanage is gone from maps and deeds, but not from the land, nor from the quiet dread that grips those who remember. And in the Kentucky hill country, even now, the question lingers, what was buried in the silence of that place, and why does the ground refuse to forget?